Yvonne was overjoyed when she enrolled in medical school and got a scholarship. Her mother Sarah was equally elated. As a single mother with limited income, paying for tuition would have been impossible. This budgeted position was a dream come true. However, their happiness was short-lived. One evening, Sarah collapsed in the hallway upon returning from work. Fortunately, Yvonne was home and quickly called an ambulance. The responding doctor diagnosed a stroke. Yvonne found herself torn between the hospital and her studies. Mornings were spent at lectures, evenings at her mother's bedside. Sarah lay motionless and speechless like a vegetable, her open eyes brimming with tears. Despite the doctor's grim prognosis, Yvonne continually reassured and comforted her mother. It seemed a cruel fate for a woman of only 45, one who had worked tirelessly all her life to provide for her daughter, rarely resting. This was the harsh result of her selfless efforts. Yvonne wept as she left the hospital and visited a church in hopes of divine intervention. Sadly, her prayers went unanswered, and Sarah was discharged home, still immobile. If Yvonne had thought she was in agony before, now her life had become a living hell. She felt suffocated by her circumstances. At home, her mother required constant care. At the medical school, missing classes risked expulsion, potentially crushing her dream of becoming a doctor. Nevertheless, Yvonne strived to manage it all. She soon developed a routine, balancing her mother's care with her studies. Kind neighbours suggested hiring a nurse, but Yvonne couldn't afford one. Her mother's meagre pension barely covered essentials. That's when Yvonne decided to find work. Many classmates worked night shifts as hospital orderlies, but Yvonne couldn't leave her mother alone at night. Instead, she took a job cleaning building entrances in the evenings. Working in 2 nearby buildings for 2 to 3 hours each evening, she earned enough to cover her mother's medications and basic groceries. One evening, an unpleasant incident occurred. As Yvonne cleaned the stairs, a woman and a young man entered. The man accidentally kicked over Yvonne's water bucket, soaking his expensive shoes. His companion gasped and berated Yvonne. "Why are you putting buckets here? It's impossible to pass by or drive by." "People don't drive through here," Yvonne replied calmly, wiping up the spill. "They walk, and should watch where they're going." "Look at her, Timothy. She's talking back instead of apologizing." "Why should I apologize?" Yvonne asked evenly. "Your companion spilled the water, creating more work for me. The bucket was in plain sight. I don't understand how he missed it." "You're right." The young man smiled sheepishly. "I was daydreaming. It's fine. Please forgive me." "Timothy, what are you saying?" the woman exclaimed. "This cleaner ruined your shoes. Do you know how much they cost?" "My dear, don't fret. We'll dry the shoes," he replied, then turned to Yvonne. "I apologize for causing you extra work." The girl nodded silently in response, but Timothy's companion, before she left, promised to get her in trouble. Of course, Yvonne did not take all these threats seriously, and even when the head of the Housing and Utilities Department called her and informed her that she had received a complaint, she was not worried. The girl explained to the chief what had happened. "Yes, I know, Miss Shortraw," sighed the man. "She blew everybody's brains out, and the neighbours, and our office. She's a scandalous, nasty woman, and she teaches somewhere. Okay, I understand everything about your fight, but try not to mess with her any more. She's a very unpleasant lady. She can complain to the mayor. It's happened before." "I see," Yvonne shrugged. "I'll try not to cross paths with her." Afterward, she had to meet Miss Shortraw at the house anyway, but they both pretended not to know each other. Miss Shortraw only cast disparaging glances in the girl's direction, and Yvonne noticed that with this Miss Shortraw came all kinds of young men. However, This did not concern the girl at all. It seemed that they would never cross paths again, but an incredible thing happened. In the new semester at the medical school, a new teacher came. It was Miss Shortraw, and she read a course of philosophy. The subject, of course, is not the most important in medical school, and therefore all the students did not take it seriously. Besides, they knew that no one had ever had any problems with passing philosophy before. True, it used to be taught by another professor, but that's the second thing. Why would a doctor need this philosophy? And unfortunately, everyone was wrong. Miss Shortraw demanded, and demanded. The students were terrified of the upcoming exam, and Yvonne, too, she realized that Miss Shortraw recognized her. The teacher looked at her unkindly, but still Yvonne hoped that she would pass, because she was preparing diligently. She wrote all the essays, wrote down the lectures, and even did not miss any of them. Yvonne generally studied well, even though her schedule was exhausting. When the time came to take the exam, all the students were very nervous. But as it turned out, Miss Shortraw gave positive marks to all of them. True, the boys got better marks than the girls, but Yvonne was cut off at the root, although the girl answered her questions quite well. "Go on. Prepare yourself further," Miss Shortraw said with a slight smirk. Yvonne lowered her head and nodded in response. "Only I have great doubts whether you will pass the exam," Miss Shortraw added with a snaky smile. "It is better not to torture yourself and me. Do what you're best at. Wash the floors." Yvonne didn't answer anything this time. She just left the room, and her heart pounded in alarm. Would Miss Shortraw take revenge on her? But for what? For getting her lover's feet wet? But that would be absurd. Nevertheless, that's precisely what happened. Yvonne, the only one from the entire course, did not pass philosophy at the second or third attempt. A committee was appointed. Even the dean was surprised because Yvonne had passed all the other subjects well. And the most annoying thing was that Yvonne had learned everything, but Miss Shortraw kept piling her with additional questions. No, Yvonne answered them, but the teacher said with a sneer that it was not enough. And now Yvonne was preparing for the commission. It was very hard. For the 10th time she studied all the philosophy lectures, not forgetting to do all her daily chores, washing the entrances, taking care of her mother. Unfortunately, Sarah's condition wasn't improving. "Don't worry, Mummy, we'll get through this," Yvonne said while changing her mother's clothes. Truthfully, she had already given up hope and was mentally preparing to be expelled from the medical school. It was a shame, but what else could she do? Complain to the dean about Mrs. Shortraw? Who was Yvonne compared to the teacher? Just one of many students, and not a particularly diligent one, according to the administration. The time for the retake exam arrived. The commission consisted of 3 people: a young associate professor, Ms. Shortraw, and the head of the philosophy department, Mrs. Roche. All the students adored Mrs. Roche. She made her seemingly dull subject fascinating and wasn't harsh during exams. Unfortunately, she didn't teach Yvonne's course. Mrs. Roche, a handsome and pleasant woman in her 50s, was rumoured to have raised 2 children, a son and a daughter, alone after her husband left her for another woman. She lived a solitary life, which surprised many. Unlike Ms. Shortraw, who revelled in male attention, Mrs. Roche remained alone, despite her youthful appearance and charm. However, none of this mattered for the upcoming exam. Yvonne took the test at the department. In a small room, the committee waited. Miss Shortraw nodded towards the exam tickets. "Take one," she said. Yvonne hesitantly complied. What was she afraid of? She had studied everything, or so she thought. That damn question, the one she'd always avoided and ultimately forgotten in the chaos of preparation, was now staring her in the face. Yvonne sat across from the committee, frantically trying to recall anything relevant. The associate professor was engrossed in a magazine. Mrs. Roche gazed pensively out the window, and Miss Shawtraw watched Yvonne with a smirk. 10 minutes left, Miss Shawtraw said. Or just leave now and accept the inevitable. Yvonne shuddered at the barbed words, shook her head, and pretended to write. Mrs. Roche glanced at her colleague and the student in surprise, then excused herself and left the office. She returned 2 minutes later. Miss Shawtraw, you're urgently needed in the Dean's office, she announced. Miss Shawtraw raised her eyebrows, but couldn't disobey. Once she left, Mrs. Roche approached Yvonne, glanced at the question, and spoke quickly. Here, write down. She began dictating the answer. Yvonne, surprised, obediently wrote. As she did, she realized she did know the material. It had just been phrased differently. After dictating, Mrs. Roche returned to her seat. You didn't see anything, she said to the associate professor. I didn't. The young teacher smiled, indifferent to both the subject and Yvonne. His mind was on his research. He was only there by chance. Miss Shawtraw soon returned, looking puzzled. Mrs. Roche, I could have signed those papers later, she said irritably. No, it was urgent, the woman replied, then turned to Yvonne. Well, are you ready to answer? The girl nodded eagerly. As Yvonne answered, Miss Shawtraw looked at her in surprise, then shifted her gaze to Mrs. Roche, her face contorting with anger. Did you let her cheat? She hissed. Absolutely not, Mrs. Roche smiled. We have been keeping a close eye on her. Isn't that right? The associate professor nodded in response. Yvonne passed philosophy, despite Miss Shawtraw's insistence that she shouldn't get more than a C. It was still a victory. The teacher glared at Yvonne, but she didn't care. She wouldn't encounter Miss Shawtraw again, or take any more of her classes. Yvonne whispered, Thank you, to Mrs. Roche, who pretended not to hear and simply walked by. Mrs. Roche was a fair and kind person. She had inquired about Yvonne's studies beforehand and realized that philosophy wouldn't be crucial for her future. Yvonne continued her studies without further problems during exams. However, life didn't get easier for her. Her mother remained ill, with little hope of recovery. Meanwhile, Miss Shawtraw soon became embroiled in a scandal involving another affair. Her young lover left her, and Miss Shawtraw tried desperately to win him back, even confronting his wife. When this became known at the medical school, the teacher was quietly asked to resign. Nothing more was heard about Miss Shawtraw after that. Yvonne successfully graduated from medical school, but her achievement was overshadowed by tragedy. Her mother passed away quietly. Yvonne found herself alone. Living in an apartment filled with memories of her mother became unbearable, so she decided to move to the capital. She sold the apartment and left, disappearing from everyone's radar. Years passed. Mrs. Roche no longer worked at the medical school. She was nearly 70, not an exceptionally advanced age, as some colleagues still worked, but her health began to falter. At first, she attributed it to aging. Then, growing concerned, she consulted doctors. That's when they discovered a tumour in her brain. The exact nature of the tumour could only be identified after specialised tests. She needed surgery, which wasn't fully free. Unfortunately, the woman lacked the necessary funds. During a lifetime of work, she hadn't managed to save much. She decided to ask her children for help. Her son was doing well with his own car repair company, while her daughter worked in the travel industry. "Mum, how am I supposed to give you that kind of money?" exclaimed Alison, Mrs. Roche's daughter. "You know my husband and I have a mortgage, and my son attends an expensive school. We really don't have extra money. Ask Don." But her son also claimed he had nothing. All his money was tied up in the business. "Mum, why do you need to pay right away? Get on the waiting list. There should be quotas for such operations." was Don's only advice. Mrs. Roche felt deeply hurt. Her children seemed to have forgotten everything she had done for them. True, they had made their own way in life, but Mrs. Roche had given them a solid foundation. Her husband had left when Alison was 5 and Don was 7. The alimony was meagre and irregular. Mrs. Roche had deprived herself of everything to ensure her children were well fed and had all they needed. She always economized on herself. From the outside, Mrs. Roche always looked neat and tastefully dressed. A decent suit or shoes could last for years, but those wretched tights seemed to tear at the speed of light. Sometimes she couldn't afford to buy new ones. There was no money for a hairdo either. Thankfully, Mrs. Roche wore her hair in a bun. Her hair was gorgeous, her only wealth. No one would have guessed that she washed it with the cheapest shampoo and rinsed it with chamomile tea. Everyone thought Mrs. Roche wore minimal makeup as a style choice, but in reality, she simply couldn't afford good mascara or eyeshadow. Cheap cosmetics made her skin itch and her eyes water. She didn't wear a good perfume either, though she longed to. There was one fragrance she liked. Her colleague, Miss Shawtraw, used it, but it was far too expensive. She didn't wear earrings, claiming she disliked having things hanging from her ears. The truth was, she couldn't afford to buy it, and there was no man in her life to give her such gifts. Yes, her salary as a department head wasn't enormous, but it was decent. However, Mrs. Roche had 2 children, and she alone was responsible for them, sometimes a little too much. She had paid for Alison's expensive language and math courses, so her daughter could easily enter her dream university. She had even taken out a loan to help Don with his first tyre shop, enduring financial bondage for nearly 5 years. And now, when their mother needed help, the children seemed to have forgotten everything. It hurt and offended her, and she couldn't decide which feeling was stronger, the pain or the offence. The pain wasn't just emotional. The elderly woman's head ached so severely it felt as if her skull might crack. Mrs. Roche resorted to the cheapest painkillers, as anything stronger required a prescription. Without an accurate diagnosis, no doctor would prescribe such medication, and there was no one else to help this poor woman. Her days passed in a blur. Each morning she took her pills and tried to do housework, but everything slipped through her fingers. The unknown was the worst part. What was happening in her head? How long did she have to live? Her children called and visited for tea as if nothing was wrong. Mrs. Roche fed them cakes she baked out of habit and chatted with them. She never asked about money again, and they remained silent on the subject. Occasionally, Alison brought herbs and supplements that were supposed to help, and that she bought during another trip abroad with her husband and son. Don increasingly talked about only his problems: rising prices, unscrupulous suppliers, insolent customers. Mrs. Roche listened, offering agreement when necessary, advice when asked, even sympathy. What else could she do? They were her children. She felt sorry for herself to the point of tears, but she never spoke of her troubles and pain in front of her son and daughter, and they didn't see it or sense it. Both Alison and Don somehow convinced themselves that their mother's problem wasn't really a problem at all. Then Mrs. Roche fainted. She had gone to the store for milk. The last thing she remembered was entering the supermarket. Suddenly, everything swam before her eyes. She felt dizzy, and then darkness engulfed her. Mrs. Roche woke up in the hospital. The young doctor explained at length that in her condition she couldn't ignore her health. She needed treatment. Yes, it would cost money, but health was more valuable. But where could she get the cursed money? She had worked honestly all her life, but what good had it done her? You see, we can perform diagnostic surgery for free, but it might only worsen your condition. you need special equipment and a highly qualified surgeon. Unfortunately, we can't offer that within the framework of your medical insurance," the doctor explained. "I understand," Mrs. Roche sighed, "but I have no money." "What about children? Husband? Family? Relatives? Can't anyone help?" Mrs. Roche barely shook her head, as it was still spinning. But what could she tell the doctor? That her children were suddenly out of that game? Her husband had left her long ago. She had no real relatives, and she couldn't ask acquaintances or colleagues for money. She didn't want to beg, as she saw it. No, it wasn't pride. It was simply how she'd always lived, solving her own problems. Even now in the hospital, Mrs. Roche didn't bother anyone, not even her children. She knew Alison was off again somewhere with her husband and son, while Don and his family were at the seaside. Why disturb them? She'd only spoil their mood, and her own. They wouldn't help anyway. After 5 days in the hospital, Mrs. Roche began preparing for discharge, believing nothing more could be done. But before she left, her doctor unexpectedly poked his head into her room. Dr. Alvarez genuinely wanted to help this kind elderly woman. A former professor of philosophy, he knew Mrs. Roche had worked at their medical school for years, almost a colleague, one might say. But there was nothing he could do. Everything he'd told her was the truth. And then, such luck. "Mrs. Roche," the doctor began excitedly from the doorway. "Dr. Kaufmann, a famous surgeon, is coming to our hospital tomorrow. From Germany. To be honest, I don't know much about him myself. I haven't had an opportunity to look him up online, so I came straight to you. I've heard from colleagues that he's an excellent neurosurgeon. He'll be consulting in our department tomorrow, just for the day. Can you imagine? Anyway, I've already scheduled an appointment for you." "Why?" Mrs. Roche shrugged weakly. "He'll probably charge an exorbitant amount, being so famous." "Still, his consultation won't be superfluous," the doctor insisted. Mrs. Roche only sighed. She had already given up, accepted. However long she had left, she would live. Why all this fuss? Nothing would help her. Yet to avoid offending the doctor and his desire to help, she agreed to the appointment. For this, Dr. Alvarez delayed her discharge by 1 more day. The next morning, the doctor practically flew into the room. "Mrs. Roche, let's go, they're waiting for us." The doctor enthused, like a boy. "Oh, it's so unexpected. Such a mix-up, really. I thought this surgeon was a man, but it's—" "An alien?" Mrs. Roche smiled faintly. "You're joking. That's a good sign. No, it's a woman. She's quite young, and apparently a very talented surgeon. We've even had a brief chat." "Didn't you say this doctor is from abroad? Do we need to speak German?" "No German needed. She's our compatriot. Only her last name is her husband's." Dr. Alvarez smiled. "In fact, it turns out that Dr. Kaufmann was born and lived in our city." "Is that so?" Mrs. Roche raised an eyebrow. Soon, she found herself sitting in the office of the famous neurosurgeon. As Dr. Alvarez had said, it was indeed a young woman. Slender and petite, one couldn't immediately guess she was a surgeon. Only her strong fingers and keen eyes betrayed her profession. Mrs. Roche also had the nagging feeling she'd seen this Dr. Kaufmann somewhere before. The doctor was silent, studying the medical history. Mrs. Roche, too, remained quiet, hesitant to ask anything. At last, Dr. Kaufmann put the papers aside and looked attentively at the old woman. "Well, everything is clear to me," she said. "The case isn't easy, but we can't delay. You need surgery." "I won't be able to pay for this operation," replied Mrs. Roche, swallowing an unexpected lump in her throat. "I've already told my doctor about it. I don't know why I came to you. I apologize for wasting your time." "Did I say anything about money?" Dr. Kaufmann raised her eyebrows. I'll operate on you for free." "Free of charge?" gasped the elderly woman. "But how? Is it possible? I was told it couldn't be. Expensive equipment, materials, plus your labour." Dr. Kaufmann lingered her gaze on the patient and smiled. "Mrs. Roche, don't you recognise me at all?" she asked. "To be honest, I have a feeling we've met before," admitted the woman. "Of course we have." Yvonne smiled again. "Remember, 20 years ago, you were part of the committee examining a negligent student. I couldn't pass philosophy then, and you helped me. You sent the teacher who disliked me to the dean's office on some pretext and dictated the answer to the question. Do you remember?" "I remember," Mrs. Roche said faintly. "Yvonne, I think it was O'Reilly. I remembered your last name for some reason. Miss Shawtraw was your teacher at the time. She once said in the department that she was annoyed by one of the cleaners who dreamed of becoming a great doctor, and she was sure to clip her wings. I tried to reason with her, but no way. Miss Shawtraw was vindictive. I don't know what happened between both of you. Anyway, it doesn't matter." "Yes, it was me," answered Yvonne thoughtfully. "Back then I really did clean the floors in the evenings after school. My mum was sick, and there wasn't enough money. It was hard once I spilled water on her lover's shoes, and that's how it all started." "But it ended well," smiled Mrs. Roche. "I'm overjoyed that you realised your dream." "And not without your help," Yvonne smiled. "Yes, it's funny, but I would have dropped out of the medical school if you hadn't helped me. I've been thinking about you all these years. I even wanted to thank you personally once, when I came to the city to visit my mother's grave. I visited the medical school, but they told me that you hadn't worked there for a long time. I thought I'd never see you again. And then I ran into you. Mrs. Roche, don't worry. I'm telling you, with all confidence, that everything will be fine. Today, I'll prepare the documents to transport you to the capital's clinic, where I'll be able to operate on you." "But you're thinking about money again," smiled Yvonne. "Don't think about it at all. I'll take care of all expenses." "It must be costly." "No more expensive than what you once did for me." Yvonne touched Mrs. Roche's hand. "It's just my gratitude to an excellent person." Mrs. Roche nodded uncertainly in response. A few days later, she was flown by air ambulance to the capital, where Yvonne performed surgery on Mrs. Roche in one of the clinics. The tumour turned out to be benign but quite large, so Dr. Kaufmann had to do her best. But her knowledge, experience, and the latest equipment made this delicate work excellent. For a while, Mrs. Roche remained in the clinic for treatment and rehabilitation, with Yvonne visiting her regularly. Recently, Yvonne had been spending more time in her native country and was even considering moving back permanently. Yvonne shared her life story with Mrs. Roche. After graduating from the medical school, she moved to the capital, where she faced challenges, housing difficulties, and an autocratic head doctor. However, her fortunes changed when she met Benjamin, an ambitious businessman dreaming of building his own empire, though taxes and competitors often hindered his plans. Unexpectedly, Benjamin discovered he had a grandfather living across the ocean. This wealthy man, estranged from his daughter-in-law and grandson for years after his son's death, reached out to Benjamin as his health declined. "We are the same blood, you bear my surname," he wrote. Despite her initial reluctance, Benjamin's mother recognized this as an opportunity for her son and allowed him to go. Yvonne accompanied Benjamin abroad. Shortly after their arrival, his grandfather passed away, leaving his entire fortune to Benjamin. While Benjamin took the helm of a large company, Yvonne pursued her passion in medicine. After obtaining the necessary credentials, she began working in a clinic. Mentored by skilled surgeons, she quickly became an excellent specialist. Her continuous learning, valued opinions, and adopted practices led her to become a luminary in neurosurgery. Later, she opened her own clinic, but maintained ties with her homeland, practicing and consulting there. Yvonne and Benjamin now have a growing daughter, a beautiful home, and financial security. Yet despite their apparent success, they increasingly feel drawn back to their homeland. Benjamin's mother's refusal to move abroad has further influenced their thoughts of returning. "Yes, Germany is good, but home is better," Yvonne said with a smile, as she concluded her story to Mrs. Roche. "I believe everything will work out for you here too," the woman replied confidently. Yvonne had never inquired about Mrs. Roche's family, but one day she decided to broach the subject. After all, during the woman's 2-month stay in the capital hospital, Yvonne had been her only visitor. "They call," Mrs. Roche replied with a sigh. "Both my son and daughter. They ask when I'm coming home." "It's not such a great distance from our hometown to here. Couldn't they have visited? You've been here for almost 2 months," Yvonne remarked. Mrs. Roche merely waved her hand and sighed. She wanted to keep silent, but couldn't. She confided in Yvonne about how her children had repaid her care and attention. "Honestly, Yvonne, if it weren't for you, who knows how long I would have suffered, although the tumour was benign." "For now," Yvonne replied tensely, her mind elsewhere. "It would have surely turned malignant if it hadn't been removed, and before that, you could have lost your sight completely." That same day, Yvonne found Mrs. Roche's son and daughter's contact information in her documents. Emergency contacts the woman had listed. Yvonne called Alison first, explaining who she was and why she was calling. "The surgery was complex, and she's about to be discharged. Yes, everything went well, but she should be under supervision for a while. All household chores are difficult for your mother now, cleaning, cooking, even bathing. She'll need help for about 6 months. Are you prepared for that? If not, you should consider hiring a caregiver," Yvonne explained to Mrs. Roche's daughter. "6 months? Do you know how much caregivers cost? I can't afford that. Besides, Mum said she was feeling fine," Alison replied, irritation creeping into her voice. "What? Can't even cook pasta on her own?" "Pasta. Perhaps she can manage, but Mrs. Roche's diet after such an operation needs to be quite different. Moreover, your mother needs positive emotions. Do you understand?" "I understand, but I'm not here to bright her mood. Okay, we'll figure it out," Alison replied dryly. "Doctor, thank you so much for curing my mum. When will she be discharged? I'll come and take her home." Yvonne provided the date, although she disliked Alison's tone. She realised that she wasn't going to follow her advice. She'd bring her mother home and leave her in an empty apartment. At best, she'd only call in the evenings. Then Yvonne called Mrs. Roche's son, but Don, citing his busy schedule, said that Alison would handle everything. It would be easier for her as a woman, especially since she was the daughter. Now it became clear that Mrs. Roche's adult children didn't really need her. Yvonne felt so sorry for her beloved patient. Such a good woman didn't deserve such treatment. Yvonne considered suggesting that Mrs. Roche stayed in the capital. She and Benjamin had an apartment here, and they could hire a nurse. But the doctor realised that her patient was already thinking of home, her own apartment, and was unlikely to agree. This proved true when Yvonne offered the option, explaining that in the capital, Mrs. Roche would receive better medical supervision. "Yvonne, thank you for everything, but I'd rather go home. As you know, familiar walls help," Mrs. Roche replied with a sad smile. Yvonne didn't mention the conversation with the children, but the elderly woman realised there would be little help from either Alison or Don. On the appointed day, Alison came to pick up her mother. Yvonne warmly said goodbye to Mrs. Roche and they parted, agreeing to call each other regularly. When Mrs. Roche returned to her apartment, a woman arrived the same day. introducing herself as a caregiver. Her name was Mary. "Did Alison hire you, or was it Don?" Mrs. Roche asked, confused. Her children had, as expected, left her alone in the apartment, but without mentioning a nurse. "No, the contract was signed by Yvonne Kaufman," Mary said, and presented all the necessary documents. Bewildered, Mrs. Roche called Yvonne. "Dr. Kaufman, why are you doing this?" Mrs. Roche said, as soon as Yvonne answered. "You've already done so much for me, and a nurse. It's all so expensive." "Mrs. Roche, it's worth more than money." Yvonne smiled into the receiver. "Don't refuse. I'll be offended if you do. After all, if you hadn't helped me years ago, this wouldn't be happening now. Mary will stay with you as long as you need. Get well, Mrs. Roche." Mrs. Roche accepted Yvonne's help, realizing it was indeed difficult for her to be alone. 6 months later, Mrs. Roche was as healthy as could be expected for her age. She and Yvonne, now living in the capital with her family, often called each other. Alison and Don called too, and Mrs. Roche was happy to hear from them. How could it be otherwise? They were her children, and she held no grudge. Because she was a mother, she forgave them. That's how her kindness came back to her. Help arrived from an unexpected source. It seemed like heaven's will. Because good always returns.